Thank you for coming out this evening, and I look forward to a good discussion. The topic I want to talk about this evening is one which, the more I read on the topic, the more it becomes compelling to me, at any rate, that the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably among the least complicated, least controversial in the world today. The consensus on the historical record, the consensus on the human rights record, the consensus on the legal diplomatic record, basically the past, the present, and the future, is quite broad, and one can almost say it's remarkable. And now, when I made that initial statement, some people laughed, because obviously it's quite at odds with the perception of the conflict when we enter into the public arena, where we're told how complex, how controversial, how intricate this Israel-Palestine conflict is, and what a tough nut it is to crack. I was on the way here reading a new book by one of the negotiators at Camp David, a fellow named Aaron David Miller, and he writes his account on the Camp David negotiations in 2000 and basically the whole period of the 1990s up to the present. And he goes on at some great length about how complicated this question is and how nobody would want to tackle it. But I don't think that's what the record shows. The record shows it's not very complicated at all. And then the obvious question arises, if what I'm saying is true, and the burden of my remarks this evening is to demonstrate what I'm saying is true, if what I'm saying is true, then how do you account for all the controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict when you enter the public arena? And the main argument I'm going to make this evening is that most of that controversy is contrived. It's artificial, it's fake, and it's designed, its purpose is to divert people's attention from what the record actually shows and to sow confusion about that record. Well, let me begin with a fairly straightforward, accessible, and recent illustration. In July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, it rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. Some of you who are familiar with the topic will perhaps know the conclusion the World Court reached, namely that the wall Israel is building is illegal, that it has to be dismantled, and that Israel has to pay compensation for the damages wrought. In fact, that was probably the least significant aspect of the World Court advisory opinion. And the reason why is this. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo of this thing called the peace process, one aspect of this peace process is what's called the final status negotiations. And that basically means those aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict which are said to be so controversial, complex, and intricate that they have to be deferred, put off until the last stage of negotiations, because if you start with these issues, the whole process will break down. So the usual sequence is to claim we first need confidence-building measures, another catchphrase of this thing called the peace process. First we need confidence-building measures, and then we can proceed to those tough final status negotiations. Well, it so happens that before the World Court, the International Court of Justice, could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel has been building, they first had to rule on nearly all the final status questions. The final status questions are usually said to consist of four. Number one, borders. What are the legitimate borders of the state of Israel? What would be the legitimate borders of a Palestinian state? Number two, settlements. The status of the settlements that Israel is building in the occupied Palestinian territories. Number three, Jerusalem, the status of East Jerusalem. And number four, the question of the refugees. Well, it so happens that the World Court had to rule on the first three questions, borders, settlements, and Jerusalem, before it could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel is building, for reasons which will be obvious to everybody in the audience. If the borders of Israel extended all the way into the West Bank, tentatively or factually, then obviously the wall would be legal or tentatively legal. For reasons that every property owner in this room knows, if you have a quarrel with your neighbor, you're allowed to build a fence or construct a fence along the border with your neighbor, but you're obviously not allowed to build a fence around your neighbor's swimming pool or garage. These aren't particularly complicated questions of law, and the same principle applies here. So we have to first know where the border is before we can determine the legality of the wall that's being built. And the same principle applies to the settlements, because as it happens, the wall that's being built takes what the court calls a sinuous route that goes around the settlements. Well, the settlements are legal, that's fine. But if the settlements are the equivalent of your neighbor's swimming pool, well, obviously questions arise. And so the World Court had to proceed to answer these questions. Allegedly, and you'll bear with me to the point of tedium, I hope, but because it keeps being said, these questions are so controversial. They're so complicated. Well, what did the World Court decide? Number one, on the question of borders. The International Court said there's a fundamental principle of international law. It's stated in a preambular paragraph of the famous UN Resolution 242, namely the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Basic principle of international law, said to be anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, Israel, which conquered the West Bank and Gaza during the June 1967 war, it acquired them by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to them. Why? Because it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And so the World Court rules Israel has no title to any territory outside its pre-June 1967 border. And it's very clear it refers to the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory, capital O, capital P, capital T, and the abbreviation is usually OPT. I mention it only because it's considered now a commonplace. If you open up any human rights report in the occupied territories, you will see everywhere they are referred to as occupied Palestinian territory, paren OPT. It's a non-controversial question. They were acquired by Israel through war. Israel has no title to them. These are occupied Palestinian territory. They are not, as is often said in the public life, these are not disputed territories. These are occupied Palestinian territories. No dispute about the matter of ownership. I was reading today that Mr. Rumsfeld used to refer to them as the so-called occupied Palestinian territories, but it's not so-called and it's not disputed, says the World Court. Number two, the question of the settlements, the 460,000 settlers that Israel has transferred to the West Bank and previously to Gaza. What is their status under international law? Again, the World Court says it's just not controversial. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states unambiguously, or as lawyers like to say, in plain language, that it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. And therefore, the World Court says, quoting the United Nations Security Council resolutions, that the settlements in the occupied territory constitute a flagrant violation of international law. Full stop. Number three, we're often told that the question of East Jerusalem is, apart from the question of the refugees, the most complicated to resolve. And it's true, if you read the record of Camp David, it's probably correct to say that the refugee question, the Jerusalem question was the toughest nut to crack. There was a huge amount of energy invested in trying to resolve that particular question at the practical level. But legally, there is no issue at all. How did Israel acquire East Jerusalem? It acquired East Jerusalem in exactly the same manner as it acquired the West Bank and Gaza. It acquired East Jerusalem in the course of a war. And under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to East Jerusalem. If you read the court decision, it's very explicit. It refers to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and the Gaza Strip as occupied Palestinian territory. No dispute, no question, no controversy, no complexity. Now, even that is really only part of the story. First of all, World Court, international court decisions are often quite close. It works basically like our own Supreme Court. Cases rise to the top, so to speak, because they bear on controversial issues which are close legally. That's why they reach the Supreme Court. And as everyone in this room knows, Supreme Court decisions are often quite close, as are our World Court decisions. So you take one which you would think is a no-brainer. Let's say 1996, Physicians for Human Rights submits a question to the World Court on the legality of nuclear war, or the use of nuclear weapons. I think the technical term was the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, the fundamental principle of the laws of war, as everyone in this room knows, is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And it would seem to be pretty obvious that insofar as nuclear weapons are incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants by their nature, they're indiscriminate weapons, insofar as they're incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants, you would think it's obvious they are illegal under international law, their use. No, the World Court was a very close vote, and the tie-breaking vote was cast by the president of the court. So even when you would think something would be fairly straightforward, it was not. I don't particularly agree with the decision of the court, but it was actually a quite interesting decision, and the dissents were, especially by this fellow Judge Viramantri, were very interesting to read. Why do I mention it? Because when you come to the World Court advisory opinion on these complicated issues to which I just referred, the vote wasn't close at all. it was 14-1. The one dissenting vote by the American judge Thomas Bergenthal, to which I'll return to in a moment. It was not a close vote. These are not, under international law, complicated questions. These are tenets, fundamental principles of international law, which were being tested in the advisory opinion. Or you could look at it from another angle. World court decisions or opinions, when you take what's called the majority opinion, the separate opinion, the declaration, and the dissents, they can be quite substantial. So I was reading the 1984 World Court opinion when Nicaragua went to the court because the United States was mining the harbors of Nicaragua. People of a previous generation will remember that. When you look at the full compendium, separate opinions, majority opinions, and so forth, it comes to a hefty 1,000 pages. And one day in the past, when I was a professor, I got to late at night when no one was around, print it out on my university printer. Now I can't do those things anymore, unfortunately. But they are quite hefty. What's interesting about this particular advisory opinion of the court, if you take all the opinions, and there were quite a few separate opinions, and Mr. Bergenthal's separate declaration, it comes to less than 100 pages. And it comes to less than 100 pages for a very simple reason. These are not complicated questions. Even you take the case of Judge Bergenthal himself. He does not issue a dissent. In the nomenclature of the court, you can issue majority opinion, separate opinion, and then the dissent, and in the middle is something called a declaration, the declaration being more neutral. Even the American judge, he was very cautious. He issues a declaration, not a dissent. And in his declaration, he begins by saying, there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then he goes on to look at what's probably the most, not controversial, but most critical question, namely the issue of those settlements. Because where there are no settlements, there'd be no conflict. And Mr. Bergenthal says, well, I have to agree. Under Article 49, those settlements are illegal. And he says, if Israel is building the wall in order to protect the settlements, then he says, I'm using his language, ipso facto, the wall is illegal. And therefore, what we find is, on the most controversial questions, and of the most controversial of the controversial questions, it's 15-0. There's no controversy whatsoever. And that obviously raises, again, the obvious question. If what I'm saying is true, then how do we account for all of this alleged controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict? Before I look at that, I want to, in the time that allows me, which is obviously limited, to go through the record on the three areas which are the substantive areas of the conflict, to put in nursery school language, the past, the present, and the future. So let's first look at the past, the history. I notice in this room there are some people who are roughly of my age cohort. I can detect them from their tie-dyed shirts, their love beads, that glazed over look in their eyes, still saying give peace a chance, still wishing they were Sonny Bono with Cher. And for those who harken back to those wonderful days of the 60s, which are not over, they will remember that probably the question in the historical record that used to generate the most controversy, the most dispute, was how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are new to the topic, the background is fairly easy to sketch in. November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly decides to resolve this conflict in Palestine. We're going to divide it roughly in half between Jews and Arabs. Immediately upon the UN resolution being passed, a conflict breaks out within Palestine. By May 1948, when Israel declares its statehood, it becomes an interstate conflict with neighboring Arab states. At the end of the war, roughly 750,000 Palestinians find themselves outside their homes. And the question always arose, how did those 750,000 Palestinians, how did they end up refugees? And the standard argument that Israel put forth, and as I said, was probably widely believed up until roughly the late 1980s, the argument was that the Arab armies stood poised on the border of Palestine, ready to invade, transmitted these radio messages, broadcasts to the Palestinians in Palestine to leave their homes, clear the field for the invading Arab armies, and after they successfully threw the Jews into the sea, then the Palestinians would be able to return to their homes. How many people are familiar with that explanation of what happened in 1948? Well, the older people must surely, because that was standard. And until the late 1980s, as I said, that was pretty much what everybody believed. And then in the late 80s, a number of Israeli historians in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, Israeli historians started going through the record from the Israeli archival point of view. And the main person who went through the record is a fellow named Benny Morris. And Benny Morris concludes, to use his language, not my own, that what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. And there's now, you could say, a broad consensus among historians that exactly that, what happened in 1948, was the indigenous population of Palestine, at any rate in the area that became Israel, was ethnically cleansed. Now, it's not true to say no debate continues, but the debate is now within fairly narrow parameters. The debate now is, was this ethnic cleansing premeditated, intentional, methodical, or was it an accident of war? Everybody knows wars generate refugees, and maybe these refugees were simply a byproduct of a war. And to show you or to illustrate how narrow this debate has become, you take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, a very smart guy. He's a historian by training, and a reasonably honest fellow for sure. He wrote a couple of years ago a book called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, part of which went through the history of the conflict. And of course he had to address the refugee question. And he says, well, yeah, it was an ethnic cleansing in 1948, but the former foreign minister says, I don't really agree with Benny Morris, Morris being one of the proponents of the notion that it was an accident of war. No, says the former foreign minister, I don't really agree with that. It wasn't an accident of war. It was quite clearly premeditated, intentional, methodical. As he puts it, it was anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer, transfer being the euphemism back then for expulsion. And so now you have the case of a former foreign minister, incidentally not an ancient former foreign minister. He was the Israeli foreign minister in 2000 during the Camp David negotiations. Even a former foreign minister and trained historian acknowledges it was not just an ethnic cleansing, but it was a premeditated ethnic cleansing anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer. Apart from the question of the refugees, probably the question that looms largest or is most in the public eye is the question of these wars that Israel has endured with its neighbors since its founding in 1948. And certainly it's a large number of wars, 48, 56, 67, the Canal War, 68 to 70, 73, 82, and then the two intifadas. And the conventional wisdom is, as Israelis like to say, with the possible exception of the 1982 war, the war in Lebanon, these were all wars of no choice wars. But that's not really what the record any longer shows. You take the case of a very excellent book. I highly recommend it. I certainly put it above my own, by Ze'ev Maoz. It's called Defending the Holy Land. Maoz is the former director of Israel's Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's a very smart guy, and obviously he held a prestigious position. That's their Israel's most distinguished Center for Strategic Studies. And he's written a very fat book. It's probably around 800 pages. It's interesting, not in any way to denigrate the book. I think the book is an excellent book. But just to put it in perspective, the book is mostly a synthesis of what all other scholars have written on the topic. It's mostly a synthesis of what you call, in scholarly language, of the monographic literature. He takes it all and tries to figure out, okay, what does it all show? Obviously, time doesn't allow me to go through those 800 pages, but it's not without interest to just listen to his conclusions. So he says, or concludes, Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. None of the wars, none, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, none was a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. The only possible exception, he says, and as I was actually interested, he qualifies it, the only possible exception is maybe 48. He goes on to say, Israel's decision makers were as reluctant and risk-averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. When Israel was willing to take risks for peace, these usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. Again, an opinion diametrically at odds with the conventional or mainstream wisdom. 67 wasn't a war of necessity. 73, the so-called Yom Kippur War, not a war of necessity. The only possible exception is 48. Now bear in mind, under international law, if it wasn't a war of necessity, which is defined very stringently, a war of necessity is when you are the object of an armed attack. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. In any other case, it's a war of aggression. And even Mr. Maoz is clear in that. He says a war of choice is just a euphemism for a war of aggression. All of the wars, with the possible exception of 48, says Mr. Maoz, were effectively wars of aggression by Israel. Well, What about the present? Maybe the historical record has been clarified because it's historical. People have had a chance to go through the documentary record. But isn't the present complicated? It's happening as it unfolds, as it were, before our eyes. And often when you read the newspapers, we are told it's very complicated. Occasionally I have the stomach, if I can use that vulgarity, to look at the New York Times and this thing named Isabel Kirshner. She's their correspondent. And Ms. Kirshner is always in a state of perplexity and confusion. She never knows what's happening. So the last time Israel invaded Gaza, she says the Israelis say the majority of fatalities were militants, and the Palestinians say they were civilians. And then the proverbial hands are thrown in the air. Who knows who's telling the truth? But in fact, it's not so difficult to know who's telling the truth. All you have to do is do what's done in every other conflict. Namely, what do reporters, journalists do? They go to the local human rights organization, which has a track record of honesty and a track record of integrity, and you ask them. So the very day that Ms. Kirshner was throwing her hands in despair, who knows who's telling the truth, Bet Selam, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, issues a press release saying we went through each of the casualties, and our conclusion, the majority were civilians. Now, it's a very interesting question with this matter of the human rights record, because on its surface, as the lawyers like to say, prima facie, you would expect there to be a lot of controversy. Why? Number one, human rights law is a relatively new body of international law. And that means a lot of the terms and concepts have not been really fleshed out and defined. One, for example, everyone in this room has heard, namely the term human shield. But what a human shield actually means is not entirely clear. Because, for example, let's say a city is under attack, and the defending country puts artillery next to civilian buildings because they have no alternative. It's, after all, a concentrated civilian area, a city. If it puts an artillery, piece of artillery next to a civilian area, is it using it as a human shield or not? It's a very tough call. And you'll see different human rights organizations reaching different conclusions about the same situation. You take the case of the last war in Lebanon. A lot of Israel's artillery happened to have been located near Arab villages in Israel. And then the question became whether it was intentional or they were simply deploying artillery in the available areas. Hard to tell. So number one, a lot of the language is ambiguous. Number two, Palestine, Israel are the most heavily monitored area in the world by human rights organizations. There are the big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and then there's this whole slew of local organizations, each of which churns out one report after another. It's very difficult to keep up with. But you would assume so many different organizations, so many different research staffs, you would assume there are going to be differences of opinion about what's actually happening. And then number three, a lot of human rights work is just very vulnerable to human error. Because what is human rights work? It's somebody going out into the field, observing the demonstration, and trying to figure out, did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And did the Israelis initiate the clash? And if they did, were they in a life-threatening situation? And if they were, did they first fire warning shots? And then if they did, were they aiming at the legs, the torso, the head? In human rights work, that all makes a difference. And this is a sophisticated Brown University audience, so you all know the film Rashomon by Kurosawa. How many of you know it? That's very impressive. I'm very surprised. This is a sophisticated audience. Or you already know the young age how to lie. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands because of a certain respect for truth, the Rashomon is several people observing the same incident and then in retrospect remembering it altogether differently. And so you would expect that people observing the same demonstration would remember it differently, or that's plausible. And one of my own surprises, and I do mean a surprise, I had gone through at one point, I was writing something, and I went through several thousands of pages of human rights reports over a 20-year period from the beginning of what's called the First Intifada in 1987 up until roughly 2005. And it was a huge amount of material to sift through, and I was genuinely surprised that literally, and I'm not fearful of a polygraph being put to my wrist at this moment, I was quite surprised that over a 20-year period, thousands of pages of reports from multiple human rights organizations, literally, I was able to find only one case of one demonstration on one afternoon in one city where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened. And the point on which they disagreed happened to have been itself quite trivial. There's no dispute, no controversy about what this record shows. Okay, what does this all mean in concrete practical reality? Let's take the most common aspect, in my opinion, not the most important, but certainly the one that's most salient, the question of fatalities during the Israel-Palestine conflict. As some of you know, January 2006, the Palestinian people, in a certified, internationally monitored election, elect the Islamic movement Hamas into power in the occupied territories. Immediately as they come to power, Israel, and then followed by the United States, impose these brutal economic sanctions among the Palestinian people, the justification being several-fold for our purposes now, the main claim being that Hamas is a terrorist organization, terrorism is illegal under international law, and that for the Palestinians to return to the community of civilized nations, their elected government has to renounce terrorism. And in fact, it seems to me that's pretty much a no-brainer. Terrorism is illegal under international law, terrorism being the standard definition, the targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal or a political aim. And so there's no point in belaboring what it seems to me is obvious. Terrorism is illegal. The targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal is immoral and illegal. So there's no point, as I said, to belaboring it, and it would be, in my opinion, obtuse to quarrel about it. No qualifications apart from the obvious one. Namely, if you apply a principle across the board to all parties to a conflict, it's a moral or legal principle. But if you only apply it to one party to the conflict, it ceases to be a moral or legal principle. It becomes, as everyone in this room knows, a hypocritical principle. And so trying as we would want to at an institution of higher learning committed to principles of truth and justice, let's apply the principle across the board. and see what the record looks like. Let's start with the raw material. The second intifada begins September 2000. If you look at the numbers up until today, about 4,700 Palestinians have been killed and about 1,000 Israelis have been killed. So strictly in terms of numbers, the ratio is now about 4.7 to 1 in terms of fatalities. That's, as they say, the first level of analysis. The second level of analysis is, of course, not to look at total numbers of fatalities, but to look at numbers of fatalities who are civilian on both sides, because according to the laws of war, it's legitimate to target combatants. So we look at the number of civilians killed. It's about, the ratio is about 3 to 4 Palestinians killed for each Israeli killed. So if we're again looking at the second level of analysis, it's still, the imbalance is quite pronounced against the Palestinians. Nonetheless, there's still a third level of analysis, which those of you who in the audience who are more acute, not to mention disturbed by my remarks, would want to make. And the third level of analysis, in my opinion, is perfectly legitimate. Namely, isn't there a difference between Palestinians targeting Israeli civilians and Israel unintentionally killing Palestinian civilians? That's the conventional argument that's made. We shouldn't sneer or snicker, I think. We should try to treat it seriously and see where it leads us. Or you take the case of Jeffrey Goldberg, who was the New Yorker's correspondent in the occupied territories. I guess he's now with Atlantic Magazine. In his recent book, I think he's only written one, in his book Prisoners, Jeffrey Goldberg has a very distinguished career. Before he was a correspondent for the New Yorker, he was a prison guard for Israel, which it seems to me is a perfect qualification for being a correspondent for the New Yorker. And by the way, a torturer. That's a fact. Mr. Goldberg, in his book Prisoners, he recounts an argument he had with a Hamas member, and he says to the Hamas member at one point in indignation and frustration, he says, "For God's sake, we don't try to kill children." The obvious point being that the children we kill, it's an accident, but you target Palestinian children, Israeli children. So again, let's look at the record. The record shows about 900 Palestinian children have been killed during the Second Intifada, which is more than the total number of Israeli civilians killed. The total number of Israeli civilians killed is about 710, of whom about 120 were children. So more Palestinian children have been killed than the total number of Israeli civilians killed. And just comparing children with children, the ratio is about 7 to 1. So our first conclusion based on the raw material is or raw data, for the want of trying to kill Palestinian children, it would seem that Israelis were awfully good at it. But is it even true that Israel doesn't deliberately kill Palestinian children? Not according to human rights organizations. So if you open up to the reports of, say, Amnesty International, they write, quote, that on many occasions Israel deliberately targeted Palestinian demonstrators, of whom many were children, in fact, overwhelmingly children. And then they say in other cases Israel used indiscriminate, excessive, and disproportionate force. For example, of the 37 Palestinian children killed in the first month of the Second Intifada, of the 37 Palestinian children killed during the month of October 2000, 20 died from a direct bullet shot to the head. Well, let's make the best case for Israel. That's how a lawyer, or I think an honest debater, would pursue the matter, not the easy case. Let's take the best case, namely the question of indiscriminate killings, not deliberate killings. But under international law, indiscriminate killing is no different than a deliberate or intentional killing. Because the principle is, it's a fairly uncomplicated principle, the inevitable and foreseeable consequences of an act count as an intention. The inevitable and foreseeable consequences of an act count as an intention. So if you spray a crowd indiscriminately with machine gun fire, the inevitable and foreseeable consequence is that civilians will be killed. And therefore, it counts as an intention. Not a particularly complicated idea. There are some people in the audience now who are very disgruntled by what I have to say. The indignation is arising in them, and they have decided the point has come to resolve this matter for once and for all. And one of the audience members rushes up to the platform, pulls out a dagger, and plunges it into my heart. And I am prematurely, at any rate in my opinion, dispatched to my maker. Brown University has this person arrested, I hope. And although it's too late to hope, the person goes before the judge, and the judge asks, do you have any extenuating explanation? And the person says, well, I didn't intend to kill ex-Professor Finkelstein. I was just testing the sharpness of the blade of my dagger. Well, obviously that explanation is ludicrous, at least I would hope it would be, because the inevitable and foreseeable consequence of plunging a dagger into my heart is, alas, I'm going to die. And so since that's the inevitable and foreseeable consequence, it is deliberate, exactly what Hamas is accused of. Okay, that's still at a level of abstraction. We're dealing with my heart. Well, let's now proceed to look at the conflict. What does it look like in reality, in the real world? We'll take the case of a wonderful Israeli journalist for Haaretz newspaper, person I genuinely admire, and as a human being I like, which is not always the same thing. His name is Gideon Levy, and Mr. Levy is covering the occupied territories, Gaza, November 2006, a fairly typical day in Gaza. Israel is firing indiscriminately artillery shells into Beit Hanun. And this is what Mr. Levy has to say. Someone who throws burning matches into a forest can't claim he didn't mean to set it on fire. And anyone who bombards residential neighborhoods with artillery can claim he didn't mean to kill innocent civilians. Therefore, it takes considerable gall and cynicism to dare to claim that Israel Defense Forces did not intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. I particularly like that dispatch, not only for its accuracy, but how, in simple journalistic fashion, he translates the legal principle, I suppose, unconsciously. He's simply using common sense, which is what legal principles are supposed to do. When they start drifting too far away from what common sense tells you, then something is going awry. So what does he say? If you fire indiscriminately into a civilian neighborhood, it takes gall and cynicism to dare to claim that you did not, and what's his word, intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. The inevitable and foreseeable consequence counts as an intention. Okay, well, where does that leave us? We could look at it abstractly. You take Israel's leading authority in international law, Yoram Dinstein, president of Tel Aviv University, very smart guy. Unfortunately, when it comes to questions bearing on Israel, he's a wretched apologist, but as a student of international law, very impressive. You open up to his standard work on the laws of war, and he says there is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of, a premeditated attack against civilians, and reckless use of force, which, making the best case for Israel, is what it's accused of. He says, and now I'm quoting him, they are equally forbidden. So, where does that leave us? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are: one, Israeli terrorism is about 3 to 4 times as lethal, and two, no demand, let alone sanctions, has been imposed on Israel to renounce terrorism. Well, if Israeli terrorism is several times as lethal as Palestinian terrorism, and no demand, let alone sanctions, is imposed on Israel, then it seems to me fairly obvious that's not a legal or moral principle. That's a hypocritical principle and deserves contempt. Well, some of you may agree so far. Some of you who are generous will agree so far. It doesn't seem to be that complicated. The numbers seem to be pretty precise. The law fairly, in these cases, pretty uncontroversial. A broad consensus. But it can't be true that this conflict is not difficult to resolve. That's very hard to believe. It's been going on twice, or I should say its most recent phase, has been going on twice as long as about 3/4 of the people in this room. Most of you are in the age 20, and it's been 40 years. That's really quite extraordinary. You take your mind like a reel, a movie reel, and you go backward, and you go from age 2, 3, your first birthday party, 2nd grade, your 4th grade teacher, your communion, bas mitzvah, bar mitzvah, sweet 16, this and that, and then you double it, and it's still going on. And can it really be that simple? How can that be? Well, let's look at the record. The record shows, for at least the past 30 years, there's been a consensus, the entire international community, on how to resolve the conflict. Some of you say, well, that's speculation. But it's not. We have a record. It's very easy to look at. Everyone in this room is computer savvy and literate. All you have to do is go to Google and type in peaceful settlement of Palestine question. That's the title of the UN resolution that's voted on every year in the United Nations General Assembly. And the vote's quite remarkable. What does the vote show? Let's take the last year of the Soviet Empire, 1989. The terms, I should say, everyone in this room knows. The terms are what's called the two-state settlement, namely a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June '67 because of that fundamental principle of international law, inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war. And then there's another principle of international law, Article 2 of the UN Charter. It's inadmissible to threaten or use force against any member state of the United Nations. So, neighboring Arab states, a newly formed state of Palestine, they have to recognize Israel's right to be free from the threat or use of force. Those are the principles. Full withdrawal, full recognition of Israel. Those are the essential principles. All right, what's the vote? 1989, the vote is 151-3. The whole world on one side, Israel, the United States, and the island state of Dominica on the other side. Time doesn't allow me to go through all of the votes, so let's just do it quickly. 1997, the vote, 155-2. 1998, the vote, 154-2. 2002, the vote, 160-4. 2003, the vote, 160-6. 2004, 161-7. 2006, 157-7. This current year just passed, the vote, 161-7. Now, some of you in this audience who are math whizzes and have a critical mind will no doubt have noticed that the vote leapt all the way from 2 to 7. And it's true. It did go from 2 to 7. Traditionally, it's been the United States and Israel. In recent years, they've been joined by Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. And that's it. The whole world on one side, and Israel and the United States and the other countries. Some of you, now all of you know those other countries. I have to admit that although once I taught the topic, I did not know them either. I think suffice to say, even though it may not be politically correct, the total populations of Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu can fit in the empty seats in this room, and there will be room left over. Okay, that's the record. And that's been the record since right after the June '67 war. I recently came across an article by a renowned authority in international law from 1970 called The Middle East Problem. The fellow's name, older people will remember him, Quincy Wright. Anyone remember Quincy Wright? Yeah, he was at, I think he was at Harvard at the time. Very smart guy, very respected. This is what he wrote in 1970. 1970, bear in mind. In view of the acceptance of Resolution 242 by the adjacent Arab states except Syria, the major obstacle to progress seems to be the refusal of Israel to do so and to agree to withdraw from occupied territories. That was the problem, 1970. Israel's refusal to withdraw from occupied territories. Fast forward to 2006. Ex-President Jimmy Carter writes a book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. What does he conclude? In what was said to be a highly controversial book. Indeed, it was said to be an outrageous book. And what did he conclude? Quote, peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when Israel is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders. The same problem in 1970 is the same problem 40 years ago. Israel's refusal to withdraw and accept its legal borders. Well, what does it mean concretely? When Hamas was elected into power, the second major allegation against Hamas was it practiced terrorism and it refused to recognize the state of Israel. As a principle, again, it's uncontroversial. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, and therefore it's illegal for there to be threats or use of force against it. No point in arguing the obvious. And Hamas's record for a time was ambiguous. You could say sometimes they made harsh statements about Israel, and you can say in more recent times, since 2006, their record has been fairly consistent, supporting the two-state settlement along the lines of the international consensus. So let's take the worst case, that in the past they have made ambiguous and in some cases harsh statements. All right, but what's Israel's record? No Israeli government has ever recognized a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border. No Israeli official has ever recognized a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967. So while these brutal sanctions are imposed on Hamas because it allegedly refuses in words to recognize Israel, in practice, the state of Israel, not words, but in practice, it's building a wall which illegally annexes between 10 and 13% of the West Bank. It's de facto annexed the Jordan Valley, another 10 to 20% of the West Bank. De facto annexed, well not de facto, de jure annexed Jerusalem, cut up the West Bank into 6 major fragments and multiple minor fragments, and has left the Palestinians approximately 50% of the West Bank on which to exercise their alleged right to self-determination. What's left? Israel's main newspaper, Haaretz, writes, between the eastward expansion of the Israeli settlements, the westward expansion of the settlements, the Palestinians are left with no territory on which to establish a state. And yet the only issue that arises in public life is why don't the Palestinians recognize Israel in words, while Israel is dismantling the Palestinian state in practice. That's the record as far as I can tell. Obviously, going through it in a rapid fashion. Then where does the controversy come from, if that's true? The controversy, it seems to me, there are 2 aspects to it. Part of the controversy, in my opinion, a small part, it is legitimate. We shouldn't pretend there are no aspects of the conflict which are controversial. Let's take the one which looms largest and which I haven't yet addressed, namely the question of the Palestinian refugees. Let's start with basics. You can agree on facts, but disagree in your moral judgments. That should be fairly straightforward. Your moral judgments don't spring from the facts of a situation. You take a case like Benny Morris. He says, I agree the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948, but he says, I think it was a good thing. He says sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. He points to the United States and he said, wasn't it a good thing that the native population was, to use his words, annihilated? Had it not been for the annihilation, again his word, of the native population, he says, you couldn't have had the great American Republic. And therefore, he says, it was a good thing. And he says it was a good thing in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, because then you got the Jewish state. And in fact, Mr. Morris is very emphatic. He becomes more emphatic as time passes, that the main error Israel committed in 1948 was that it didn't expel all the Arabs from Palestine. The ethnic cleansing, in his words, was lamentably only a partial one. It was unfortunately not a comprehensive one. If, he says, all the Arabs were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, we wouldn't have a Palestinian problem today. You know, there's some wisdom to that. Germany today doesn't have a Jewish problem. In fact, in his most recent interview, Mr. Morris says the problem now is maybe we have to nuke Iran. Nuke. He doesn't want a conventional war. We have to nuke Iran. He says, in order to put the Arabs in their place for a few generations to come. Now, you can say Morris's moral judgments are wrong in the way that you can say facts are wrong. You could say they are Nazi moral judgments, and I think that would be accurate, but you can say they are wrong moral judgments. If you leave Mr. Morris aside for the moment, and you return to the moral universe of normal human beings, you still have complications, and we should be honest about those complications. Because people can agree in their factual judgments, their moral judgments, and their legal judgments, but still disagree in their political judgments. Now that sounds a little bit more complicated, because don't our political judgments come from our legal and moral judgments? Not really, not always. Let's take a case with most of you are familiar with, at least by name. You take the case of Professor Chomsky. His view is factually the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. That's what the scholarship shows. Morally, of course, ethnic cleansings are abominations, not worth belaboring. Legally, Palestinians, of course, have the right of return, which in fact, it may come as a surprise to some people in the room, that's also an uncontroversial issue. 2000, 2001, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they issue official statements on the question of the right of return. And they write unambiguously, uncontroversially, of course, Palestinians and subsequent generations which have maintained links with the land, that's a technical language, have the right of return. And Professor Chomsky, not one to slight international law, they have the right of return legally. But then there's a separate question. We can agree on the factual, moral, and legal issue, but then there's a political question. Chomsky says, politically, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that Palestinians will be able ever, because there's insufficient political will, to ever implement the right of return. And therefore, he says, I think it's immoral to tell Palestinian refugees in Lebanon that they're going to be returning home when you know and they know they're not. Now, my own view, for what it's worth, is that's a political judgment. And a political judgment means you have to weigh 1,000 different factors and then decide on what's feasible, what's possible, and what's not. If you reach the conclusion, as Professor Chomsky, weighing the factors, if you reach the conclusion it's really not feasible, it's not possible, then I think he's right. It's immoral to give people hope when there is no hope. On the other hand, you can weigh all the factors and still say, I think it is possible that the right can be implemented. I think honest people can disagree about that question. There's only two aspects which I think honest people cannot disagree on. Number one, legally, Palestinians have a right of return. About that, there should be no question and doubt. And number two, that the overarching framework for resolving the conflict, the two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, that overarching framework is not controversial. It's very straightforward and very unambiguous. One issue that does arise and it did perplex me for some time. They would say, but if you have a right, and then you say, but you can't implement the right, then what does it mean to speak about a right? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And I see Reem nodding her head. It doesn't seem to make sense, right? It seems like a rhetorical device to say you have a right, but then sort of snatch back the right by saying, well, it can't be implemented in the real world. How many people find that perplexing to make that claim? Okay, I did too. I did too. And then last year, if you allow a personal anecdote, which I'm not at all trying to compare, I'm just trying to make an analogy which clarified the issue for me. So last year I was denied tenure at my university, and I felt, if I can use an expression, that I had the right to return. And my lawyer said, yes, I think you can win this case. But the lawyer said to me, you have to be prepared. It's going to be 6 years. That's how long tenure cases take. And she said, a wonderful lawyer, Lynn Burnaby, she said it's going to not only be costly, and she was very generous just as a matter of record, because I like her a great deal. She said, not that she was charging a humongous sum, but she said it's going to be very time consuming, because I'm going to have to spend the next 6 years preparing legal briefs for court, because no one knows the case like I do. And then she said the other option is to seek a settlement. Now, I thought I had the right of return. I felt legally my rights had been violated, and the consensus was that my rights were violated. But then I had to make a choice. Do I go for a 6-year battle, which by the time I finish, I'll be ready for retirement, or do I seek a short-term settlement? And I chose the route of a settlement. Does that mean I am acknowledging I don't have the right? No, I have the right. But I also have the option of accepting something short of the right called a settlement. And the settlement in my case is not very different than what it seems the Palestinians have been looking for. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm simply rehearsing the factual documentary record. If you look at the record of negotiations in Camp David on this whole refugee question, the Palestinians were basically looking for two things. Number one, there has to be a recognition, acknowledgement by Israel of what it did. There has to be a statement of acknowledgement of the injustice that was committed. In my own little way, that's exactly what I fought for from DePaul. They had to make a statement, and it was not easy to get that statement, acknowledging my record as a professor at DePaul. And secondly, there has to be some sort of material component. Compensation is the fancy word. And I think I'm not recommending it. I'm simply saying as a factual matter, it seems to me that's one way to look at the refugee question. But looking at it that way in no way means Palestinians don't have a right of return. They do. And Israel's position, which it's repeatedly stated, namely, we accept no historical, moral, legal, or political responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, in my opinion, it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter for the very same reason that if DePaul was not willing to make the statement on my behalf, there were no negotiations. We were going to continue and we were going to fight it out. That's how I see it. Let me now, I see I got the hook, as they say. How about if we let me go on for 20 more minutes? Does that seem fair? Okay. I want now to quickly look at the other aspect, namely the fake controversy that looms around the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it has many aspects. I'm going to just, for reasons of time, I'm going to just look at two. Number one, the pretense that this conflict is so complicated, so intricate, that it requires a knowledge the equivalent of rocket science to penetrate its mysteries. And we're told it's so complicated and so unique that you can't compare the conflict with any other conflict in the world. And the reason for that claim is fairly straightforward. Namely, when you make the obvious comparisons, Israel always ends up on the wrong side. So don't compare. Do not compare. If you look at the conflict historically, the obvious analogy, which leaps off the page, is to what happened to Native Americans in North America. But when you make that comparison, Israel is not the Native Americans. It's those that dispossessed them. So do not compare. If you make the most obvious analogy with the current situation in the occupied territories, the obvious analogy is, of course, the South Africa analogy. But if you make the comparison with South Africa, again, Israel comes out on the wrong side of the analogy, so do not compare. What's quite illuminating, I think, is that these sorts of comparisons are not only obvious, but they are so uncontroversial anywhere else in the world except for here. Former President Carter comes out with a book, Peace Not Apartheid, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, causes a hysteria in the United States. How can he compare? How can he compare Israel's main human rights organization for the occupied territories, B'Tselem? What does it conclude in its major 2002 study? The regime in the occupied territories is the only one of its kind in the world and is reminiscent of distasteful regimes from the past, such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. B'Tselem 2006 comes out with a new report on the Jews-only roads that Israel has been building in the occupied territories. What does it conclude? That this road regime bears striking similarities to the racist apartheid regime and even entail a greater degree of arbitrariness than was the case with the regime that existed in South Africa. 2006, Israel's most influential newspaper, Haaretz, refers to the apartheid regime in the territories, which remains intact. October 2007, Haaretz refers to the de facto separation, which today is more similar to political apartheid than an occupation regime because of its constancy. Israel's former Attorney General, Michael Ben Yair, he writes, "We established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories immediately following their capture. That oppressive regime exists to this day." Israel's former Minister of Education, Shulamith Aloni, the U.S. Jewish establishment's onslaught on former President Carter is based on him daring to tell the truth, which is known to all except those in the United States. Through its army, the government of Israel practices a brutal form of apartheid in the territory it occupies. And then just today, before coming here, I opened up my internet, look at leading stories, and the first item I pick up is from today's Haaretz editorial for today. The title, Our Debt to Jimmy Carter. Remember, this is Israel's mainstream most influential newspaper, and not at all radical. It supports the annexation wall. It is not a radical publication. What does it write? Third paragraph of its editorial today, or it starts, but Israelis have not liked Jimmy Carter since he wrote the book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Israel is not ready for such comparisons, even though the situation begs it. But in the United States, these are considered not just controversial, but outrageous statements. Is the conflict complicated? Well, you read the American journalism, the topic. You read Mr. Goldberg in his book, Prisoners, and he says, in order to understand the conflict, you have to understand the Arab mind. That they are consumed by this Nietzschean ressentiment. They're jealous of those Jews, and they can't understand how those Jews, who they believe they are better than, how these Jews can be dominating us. So it's all about this Nietzschean ressentiment. And then you open up to another grande tête. This one even reads French. Paul Berman. He writes a book called Terror and Liberalism. It's a big bestseller. And he says in the book, he's figured it all out. It wasn't easy. Because if you read George Packer's book, he describes Paul Berman as holed up in his room for months. Books piled from the floor to the ceiling, said Mr. Packer. And then to really impress the reader, he said, and some of the books were in the original French. And then one day, Mr. Berman came bursting out of his study and met Mr. Packer at their favorite bistro. Whenever I hear that word bistro now, I feel like Goebbels with culture. I reach for my gun. In any case, Mr. Berman tells the story. He's unlocked the whole mystery of those suicide bombers. Where does he find the master text? It's Camus, the Rebel. So all you have to do is read Camus, the Rebel. First, there was modernism. Then there was the will to rebel. Then there was the will to die, ergo suicide bombers. You have to know it in the original French to understand. But then you come across a book, not nearly as profound, Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims. Morris, he has to also address the question of why these Arabs don't like Zionism. And he writes as follows: the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Now, I have to admit, Mr. Morris has changed his views now. He's way off the map. He's, nuked the Arab world. But when he wrote this particular book, The Righteous Victims, it wasn't complicated. Notice Morris never mentions anti-Semitism. He doesn't mention hatred of Jews. He doesn't mention fear of the Enlightenment and the emancipation of women. No. Why did the Arabs not like Zionism? Because they were afraid of losing their homes and losing their country. Fear of dispossession and displacement. And then Mr. Morris goes on to make a remarkable acknowledgement. He says that fear was perfectly rational, because he says transfer, expulsion, was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. And this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs. That exactly what they feared, dispossession and displacement, is exactly what did happen and what was destined to happen if the Zionist movement triumphed. What's so odd about this conflict is, in any other place in the world, the sorts of profound explanations which are put forth would be seen to be ridiculous, the object of ridicule. So you take North America. For those of you who have studied our history, we have to be honest, the Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment was very bloody. The Native Americans, let's not be so politically correct, they killed men, women, children. It was not for no reason that if you read the old histories up until the 1950s, the old histories, they were referred to as savages. Not that the Euro-Americans were much better, and in many cases much worse, but it was a very ugly scene on both sides. Yet, what would anyone in this room think if a historian were to come along and say that the chief motor of Native American resistance to Euro-American encroachment, the chief motor was anti-Europeanism or anti-whiteism.
Or Nietzschean restoration.
You know, you would obviously laugh because the obvious explanation, fear of territorial dispossession and displacement, the obvious explanation also happens to be a sufficient one. You don't need exotic, profound explanations if the obvious one, fear of territorial displacement and dispossession, if it's a sufficient one there, as it is in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict historically, as well as today as we meet. The other type, and I have 7 more minutes, I'm watching the clock. The other type of false controversy is the playing of the Holocaust card, the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust to sow confusion and distract attention from the actual record. Time doesn't obviously allow me to go into that topic in any kind of depth. The main point to make for our purposes here is that the main innovation of this Holocaust conglomerate, this Holocaust industry, was this notion of what came to be called Holocaust uniqueness. This claim that no people in the world had ever suffered in the way that Jews suffered during World War II. And a huge publications record has continued to proliferate, trying to prove this thesis of Holocaust uniqueness. As an intellectual claim, it's completely vacuous. As a moral claim, as ought to be obvious to anyone in this room, it's an abomination. The notion of trying to rank human suffering and prove that, say, a child who's napalmed suffers less than a child thrown into a gas chamber. How do you do it? And do you really want to go there? Intellectually, it's vacuous. Morally, it's an abomination. But politically, it's quite useful. Because if you can prove that Jews have suffered uniquely, you then can make a credible claim that because of that unique history of suffering, they shouldn't be held to the same moral and legal standards as everyone else. So, Israel's the only country in the world which legalized torture. But remember the Holocaust. Israel's the only country in the world which legalized house demolitions as a form of punishment. But remember the Holocaust. Israel is the only country in the world which legalized hostage-taking, or as the Supreme Court Justice Barak called it, the taking of bargaining chips. But remember the Holocaust. Or this past summer, July 2006, 2 summers ago now, Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster bomblets on South Lebanon, the densest bombing using cluster bomblets in the history of the world. Actually, nothing compares to it. The closest was 1991, when the U.S. dropped 20 million cluster bomblets on all of Iraq. But the territory here was 1/20th the size. Another unique claim of Israel's. But we're told, remember the Holocaust. The other use of this Nazi Holocaust has, in a strange concatenation, been to either blame the Nazis for the Nazi Holocaust, blame the Arabs for the Nazi Holocaust, or to claim that the Arabs are the lineal descendants of the Nazis. So you had Mr. Ben-Gurion, 1948, Israel's first prime minister, claiming that the Arabs are the disciples and even teachers of Hitler, who know only one way of solving the Jewish problem, their total destruction. During the Eichmann trial, the Palestinian Mufti, the leader of the Palestinian movement, who was a nasty fellow, but they called him among the biggest Nazi war criminals, the real mastermind of the final solution. And then moving up to the present, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, he was called the Hitler on the Nile. Now more close to home, 1991, it was Saddam Hitler, or as Mr. George Bush Sr. used to call him, Saddam Hitler. Then 2003, 2004, it was Saddam Hitler again. Then now it's Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler, Ahmadinejad is Hitler. Everyone is Hitler, everyone is the Nazis. It's a kind of perplexity. On the one hand, we're told, never compare the Nazi Holocaust with any other crime in history, and if you make the comparison, you're guilty of Holocaust denial. But then it so happens that all of Israel's enemies, or alleged enemies, they're all Hitler, they're all threatening a Nazi Holocaust, and they're all Hitler in the past or Hitler in the future. The most recent form of this Holocaust industry is the claim of a new anti-Semitism, which began to proliferate that claim beginning in the early 2000s. The two things that could be said about the new anti-Semitism very quickly: it's not new, has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. How do we know it's not new? It's very simple. Go to your library, plug in new anti-Semitism on the subject heading or title. The first book that will come up, I'm almost certain, is a book that came out in 1974. The title, The New Anti-Semitism, written by the heads of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the league that supposedly protects Jewish rights. 1981, a book, The Real Anti-Semitism. The title, the thesis, The World is Filled with a New Anti-Semitism. Whenever Israel comes under attack because it refuses to resolve the conflict diplomatically, or because of a public relations debacle, they start up this extravaganza called the New Anti-Semitism. And they started again in 2001 because of the bad PR due to their repression of the Second Intifada. Everyone in this room can judge on his or her own whether there's any truth to this claim of a new anti-Semitism, because if you read the literature, they claim the heart, the core of this new anti-Semitism is college campuses. It's happening here, right before your eyes. They say that there are literally pogroms, riots, unfolding on college campuses, and Jews are being physically under attack. Well, I have to tell you, I was a little skeptical about that, because I've taught at many universities, more than I care to remember. I've been around the block many times, though it seems it's my last block. And one thing you could say about college campuses, they are so politically correct, you can't be anti-anything on a college campus. You know, the political correctness can sometimes get very stifling and very suffocating. You can't be obviously anti-black, anti-Puerto Rican, anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-tall, anti-short, anti-skinny, anti-fat. You can't. You can't, be anti-aesthetically challenged. No, you can. That's the completely correct term for ugly. You can. So, the notion that amidst all of this stifling and suffocating political correctness, there is this rampant anti-Semitism, of course seems slightly preposterous. I investigated a record some years ago, couldn't find any evidence of it, but of course some of you are thinking, of course you couldn't find any evidence of it. But then I opened up the Chronicle of Higher Education, the main in-house journal for academics, and the lead article reads, "It's a good time to be a Jewish student at an American college." The head of the Hillel says, "It's a golden age of Jewishness on campuses." The head of AIPAC, the main Israel lobby organization, says, "It's a glorious time not only for Jewish student life on campuses, but for the pro-Israel student movement as well," which is exactly what common sense and simple observation would tell you. You go onto a college campus nowadays, you have Judaic studies, you have Holocaust studies, you have Israel studies, you have anti-Semitism studies. The only thing you don't have is a special degree program in Jewish naval contemplation. So how can there be rampant anti-Semitism? It's just not plausible. It's not credible. Okay, what about Europe? What's the record on Europe? I looked through the record, couldn't find any evidence. That's me. So I opened up the best Zionist historian in the world, Walter Laqueur, a leading authority on all topics bearing on anti-Semitism. He writes a book called The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, came out 2 years ago from Oxford University Press. What does he conclude? Popular attitudes towards Jews were in fact slightly more favorable in 2002 in Europe than they had been in 1991. Not only is there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism in Europe, it's better now than it's ever been before there. Exactly what a rational person would conclude looking at the record. If you take the claims literally, they say in Europe, we're on the verge of a new Nazi-like anti-Semitism, a new Holocaust. It's Germany all over again. Well, then what happens? According to the most recent polls, 3/4 of Israelis want to be in the European Union, and 1/10 would actually leave Israel for Europe if they were granted EU citizenship, which means 3/4 of Israelis want Israel to be allied with Nazis, and 1 in 10 want to be exterminated. Well, and I'll leave it off here. What's the purpose of this claim of a new anti-Semitism? It's fairly obvious. Number one, to turn the perpetrator into the victim. So instead of focusing on the very real suffering of Palestinians, we're supposed to focus on the alleged suffering of Jews in the world today. And number two, to discredit all criticism of Israel as being motivated by anti-Semitism, changing the subject. Is this speculative? Everybody in this room watched it unfold about a half year ago. Jimmy Carter writes a book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. His conclusions, totally uncontroversial. What happens? First, Mr. Carter is accused of being a plagiarist by Kenneth Stein at Emory University. Second, Professor Dershowitz accuses him of being in the pay of Arab sheikhs. Then he's accused of being an anti-Semite. Then Barbara Lipstadt accuses him of being a borderline Holocaust denier. Then Neil Scher accuses him of being a Nazi sympathizer. Then he's accused of being a supporter of Arab terrorism. Notice what happened. Go back and read the reviews. Nobody talked about the content of the book. The whole discussion became whether or not Jimmy Carter was an anti-Semite. And the record he lays out in the book, not controversial, sometimes quite well done. Chapter 16, The Wall as a Prison. Conclusions are accurate. All of that, our attention is diverted from. We just focus on whether he's a Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, and so forth. Is it reason for despair? No. Actually, the Carter example should give us lots of hope and reasons for optimism. The hope and the optimism is this. Mr. Carter stood his ground. The book went on to be a #1 on the Times bestseller list, sold about 300,000 copies in hardcover. And then Mr. Carter says, I want to go into the lion's den. I want to go speak at Brandeis, the major secular Jewish university in the United States. Student body of about 2,000 turn up to listen. He speaks to the gym. Mr. Carter, he gets 4 standing ovations from an overwhelmingly Jewish student body. Professor Dershowitz is asked to deliver the reply. When he steps up to the podium, they say about 2/3 of the audience walked out. And I think that should encourage us. No, not what happened to Professor Dershowitz, but the main lessons. Number 1, stick by the factual record. Stick by the facts. And number 2, show a little bit of courage, a little backbone, a little spine. This is America. And unless you are a targeted minority, which very few of us in this room are, you have wide latitude to speak your mind and to tell the truth. Remember, this isn't Gaza. It's not throwing a stone at a tank and you're 5 years old and you end up dead. This is America. If we stick by the facts, we don't exaggerate, don't misrepresent, look at that mainstream record, and show a little courage, a little backbone, I'm very confident, more confident than ever, I think we can win. Thank you.